I think we have to recognize that there are two general perceptions of air pollution. One is what we call particulate emissions, and particulate emissions effectively have localized effects. Often people confuse local air pollution with greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that is also an externality. Global warming is a function of other kinds of emissions. So what we experience in cities like Lahore and most of Punjab, for that matter, is effectively an exposure to local particulate emissions. What shape do these emissions take? The most egregious, so there are different kinds of local air pollutants. The most egregious pollutant is what we call PM 2.5. PM stands for particulate matter, and 2.5 represents the size of the pollutant. Students perform really poorly in school when they're exposed to PM 2.5. They're both short-term and long-term effects. So short-term effects would be short-term cognitive impact. So like if you're taking a test during a polluted day, your scores might be lower than compared to similar students or similar students who are taking an identical test on less polluted days.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Political Economy this week with Asad Ejaz. But joining me today is Sanval Nasim, Assistant Professor of Economics at Colby College. He works on issues around environment, climate change, and water. Let me welcome Sanval Nasim. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Asad. Thank you for having me.
So, ladies and gentlemen, our roundup today includes talking to Samuel Nasim about smog, why it takes place during certain months of the year, what the government needs to do, what could be policy strategies that the government could be adopt, and asking him questions like whether Pakistan would ever get rid of this menace of smog. We'd also include discussions about the economic impacts of smog and what lies ahead for the new government that comes in, because all political parties in their manifestos talked about smog, talked about climate change, talked about energy, and made large commitments, which some of which could be accommodated within the government's envelope, some cannot. But let's talk to our expert today about what the government needs to do and what it can do given the amount of resources that the government has. Yeah, my first
Mhm.
question to you would be sort of, I mean, it would be great if you could highlight what smog is for our audience and just explain, why it takes place, especially during the months of November, December in cities like Lahore.
Hmm. Thank you, Asad, for that question. It's a good point to start off at. Um, so air pollution is a pretty broad thing. And I think we have to recognize that there are two uh, general perceptions of air pollution. One is what we call particulate emissions, and particulate emissions effectively have localized effects. Often people confuse local air pollution with greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that is also an externality, something that what we an externality is an economic term that we use in economics. Is but that has to do more with global warming. But localized air pollution is a function of particular kinds of emissions. Global warming is a function of other kinds of emissions. So what we experience in cities like Lahore and most of Punjab, for that matter, is effectively an exposure to local particulate emissions. Now, what shape do these emissions take? The most egregious, so there are different kinds of local air pollutants. The most egregious pollutant is what we call PM 2.5. PM stands for particulate matter, and 2.5 represents the size of the pollutant. So it's 2.5 microns. So if you want to kind of visually conceptualize what uh, uh, a particular particle looks like, is basically a tenth of a diameter of a strand of human hair. So if you take a human hair, a tenth of a diameter of a strand of human hair is what basically a PM2.5 particle looks like. Now, there are millions or billions of these particles in the air. And then when you inhale them, our own system, our body isn't able to kind of filter out particulate matter, and it easily enters our bloodstream. And now
Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that, I mean, this is both from like the economics literature, which is using a lot of observational data, plus a lot of the medical literature now that effectively demonstrates that the exposure to PM2.5 leads to significant health effects. Now, these range from, aggravated asthma or bronchitis to chronic lung diseases. In the worst case scenario, perhaps even something like cancers, etc. Now, a new strand of literature, and a lot of economists have worked on this as well using observational data, is looking at the non-health effects of exposure. So for the longest time, we were kind of worried about the direct health effects, but now we have overwhelming evidence that exposure to particulate matter, to PM2.5, have these non-health effects, and this includes, an effect on cognitive ability. Students perform really poorly in school when they're exposed to PM2.5. They're both short-term and long-term effects. So short-term effects would be short-term cognitive impact. So like if you're taking a test during a polluted day, your scores might be lower than compared to similar students, right? And similar students who are taking an identical test on less polluted days. So, it's now we have this wealth of evidence that exposure to PM2.5 has, these drastic both health and non-health effects. So
So
this translates to significant costs, right? So health costs means that your burden of like picking up health tabs goes up, doing poorly on cognitive skills, including performing poorly on school tests, for example,
hmm,
or on
hmm.
tests in general in school, or performing poorly in school, then translates into these larger kind of like, problems with educational attainment that lead to impacts on future earnings.
So, speaking of PM 2.5, something that comes to my mind is uh, the unevenness in the experience that people have in terms of, I mean, as a layman, I do not understand what emits PM 2.5. Is it like specific types of fuels or is it like specific types of vehicles? And something that comes to
Mm,
my mind is like, why is there such unevenness? So, thinking about cities like Karachi, for instance, do not experience a lot of smog, but Lahore
mm,
does. So, is there like a
mm,
specific reason why particular areas would have more smog than others?
mm. So, particulate matter doesn't necessarily have to be emitted. Like even dust, small dust particles, if they're like smaller than 2.5 microns, can constitute as particulate matter. So, but mostly a lot of the PM 2.5 comes from combustion processes. So if you burn, stubble, crop stubble, for example, that's a big sort of source of pollution, especially in
Yeah.
the winter months in Punjab. And we can sort of, come back to that later and speak about sort of crop burning. But, farmers in both sides of Punjab, in Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab, they try to, they burn their rice stubble. And so that burning process creates these tiny, tiny particles. And they can be both solids or they could be like oily particles, or they have to be liquid in nature too. So, any combustion process leads to the formation of PM2.5. In the winter months, the problem is that in places like Lahore, now geography also has a role to play in how much exposure that we get to PM2.5. So if you live in a really windy city, you can have like PM2.5 particulate emissions, but if it's really windy, the wind just basically blows the pollution away, right? But what happens specifically in places like Lahore or in Punjab in general is like in the winter months, we experience something called temperature inversion. Temperature inversion is a meteorological phenomena where there's a layer of cool air that gets trapped underneath a layer of hot air. So then you don't get a lot of air movement. So you have what we call like you're experiencing still air. So the pollution or the pollutants, these so PM 2.5 basically sticks around in the air. And in winter months, as the temperature goes down, a lot of the water in the air then condenses, especially in the mornings, and forms dew. And then when the PM 2.5 combines with this dew, it forms, it becomes much more visible. So in the winter months, Lahore and Punjab they often experience inversions, and that's why we see so much of smog in those months. In Karachi, on the other hand, you get a lot of sea breeze. So even though the emissions of pollution or the sources of there's perhaps if Karachi were to experience, this is of course, this doesn't happen in real life, it's a conjecture. But if Karachi were to experience inversions, the same amount of inversions that Lahore experiences, you'll be getting the same amount of smog or even worse smog in Karachi because it has the sources of emissions themselves in Karachi are larger than in Lahore. Now, related to your point, so here's the meteorological phenomenon why we observe smog. But related to your point, what are the sources of emissions? To get a good sense of what the sources of emissions are, we need to conduct what are called source apportionment studies. Source apportionment studies, you have environmental scientists who collect air samples, etc., and they get a good, and then often in like developing countries, for example, or developed countries, the environmental protection departments have scientists working for them who regularly conduct these source apportionment studies. But because of capacity constraints, etc., in developing countries, we often don't get these kind of studies. But what they do effectively is that they give you a sense of what the different types of pollutants are and what's the share of these pollutants in overall pollution, uh, and what those sources are, right? So you'll get a good sense of if you do a source apportionment study and you just look at PM 2.5, you'll get through these studies, you'll get a sense of what are the major sources of PM 2.5. So there have been these, so Lahore hasn't had we don't have any uh, source apportionment study to rely on to get a sense of what the different sources of pollution in Lahore are and what their contribution to overall emissions are. But there've been there's this remote sensing study done by the FAO back in 2018. And there's this recent study done by the urban unit in Lahore, which aren't exactly source apportionment, but they kind of sort of, try to mimic a source apportionment study. So everything that comes out of them should be taken with a grain of salt because there's a lot of imprecision, a lot of noise involved with the data that they collect and then the results that they produce. But these studies effectively demonstrate is that vehicular emissions is perhaps the largest source of particulate emissions in cities, followed by agriculture emissions in the winter, and then industry and power and the energy sector.
But something that comes to my mind, thank you for a very elaborate answer, but something that comes to my mind is that you talked about inversions and how cities like Lahore would be naturally more prone, apart from the wheat crop burning that takes place in certain months of the year. But apart from that, I mean, cities like Karachi would be less vulnerable because of the inversions phenomena that you just explained. But my thinking is that, I mean, a natural question that comes to my mind is why this started happening recently. I mean, we had wheat crop burning in the past as well. We had vehicular emissions of, even though, I mean, number of vehicles must have increased, but must have increased equally in cities like Lahore, Karachi, perhaps in a city like Karachi even more. Why did we start seeing smog, especially in the years after 2010 during those months, but not before?
Mhm. So, Azad, by the way, I just want to clarify that that air pollution, localized air pollution, and smog is not just a winter phenomena; is actually a perennial phenomena. It just becomes more visibly prominent in the winters because of the
Right,
inversion
right.
that I told.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you actually look at the readings, they are well above our mandated standards.
Hmm.
So, each environment is, back in the day, it was like under the federal domain. But since the 18th Amendment to our Constitution, a
Yeah.
lot of responsibilities have been handed down to the provinces, including environment. So each province sets its own environmental standards. Punjab's environmental standards are pretty robust in some ways. I mean, they kind of
Mhm.
follow international norms. But if you look at the time series data on particulate emissions, you'll notice that you can count on your hand or on your fingers the number of days pollution levels are actually within the mandated standards throughout the year. So it's not just a winter problem, but it's a perennial issue. It happens throughout the year.
Mhm.
But um, coming back to a question, which is largely a little complex. The it's not that we just started observing smog. I mean, there's also the fact that we've only recently started collecting data, and this was through a lot of public pressure, also through court interventions.
Yeah.
Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing because a lot of public policy, the problem in Pakistan is like it, especially on the environment and air pollution, it seems is being led by the courts, though it should be like more organic public policy. It should be a monitoring and enforcement of existing standards and like revision of existing standards if they're failing in certain regards. But it's also the fact that it's the Environmental Protection Department started collecting data on air pollution levels circa 2000 mid 2000 2015. And so some of us have a better sense of exactly what the air quality levels look like. The problem is a lot of this data, now that it's in the provincial domain, a lot of this data is being collected in Lahore. We don't, but the anecdotal evidence or the suggestive evidence is that the pollution levels are not just bad in Lahore, but they're like pretty atrocious throughout the province. It's just that we don't have that infrastructure, though, that monitoring ability to get a sense of what the problem looks like in other smaller towns and cities.
Mhm.
So to fill this gap, we now have like a lot of non-profit organizations and initiatives, including the Air Quality Pakistan Initiative, which has collected a series of these like low-cost private monitors that are installed across like different homes in Lahore. And so they're adding to the kind of wealth of data that we have on what air quality levels look like, right? So, but then of course, like you said, part of it is, of course, having better data and more information, but it's also since vehicular emissions, for example, is the number one source of emissions, as far as we can tell, given like the couple of studies that we have on cities like Lahore. Um, there's been an increase in the number of vehicles, and it's also endogenous because of the way the city has expanded and developed over the years. With new housing societies, we have more sprawl. You have cars, driving moving larger distances. You have a lot of people through sort of, steady development have transitioned from bicycles to motorbikes to these two-stroke engine motorbikes, which tend to be really polluting. Uh, there's a number of factors in play. It's an increase in population of the city, an increase in the number of vehicles in the city, a lack of a proper public transportation system, which means that people are not necessarily relying on the public transportation system to kind of move around. Plus more information and wealth of information that we have on what air quality levels look like.
So I'll just jump from from comparing Lahore and Karachi to perhaps comparing somebody like Lahore itself to what happens in the West. And I mean, air pollution is an issue here as well, especially due to very high number of vehicles per capita, but and much higher than, of course, Pakistan. Um, is there like a case to be made for the differences in the quality of the fuel that we're using in our part of the world? Because I've read some papers or studies that talk about the not just the quantity of emissions, but perhaps also the quality of the fuel that's being used in our part of the world. Is that a cause of concern?
Yes, that's definitely a contributing factor.
Okay.
But quality of fuels also go hand in hand with like the quality of your vehicular fleet. So it's not just the fuels, it's also the kind of cars that we have on our road,
Mm,
right? So our vehicular standards are pretty lax. I'm not talking about the fuels, but the vehicles themselves, right? So in the US, for example, catalytic converters are mandatory. We don't have such a regulation in Pakistan. The vehicular standards that I'm not familiar with what the other provinces have, but at least in Punjab, and Punjab has this. If you look at the environmental quality standards, Punjab has the in some ways the strictest standards compared to the other provinces.
mm,
Um, their vehicular the vehicular emission standards that Punjab has set is pretty lax. So given what our mandated provincial standard is, the incentives to actually like adopt cleaner vehicles is very low. But then also this is coupled with the fact that we have really poor monitoring and enforcement. This is a larger point that I actually want to make, not yeah, for the audience, is it's not as if we don't have rules and regulations. In fact, if you like I said, we have these series of environmental standards set by the environmental protection departments across all provinces.
yeah.
The problem is that these rules and regulations actually operate within a very weak institutional setting. Effectively, our monitoring and enforce, even though we have standards, our monitoring and enforcement on these standards is really weak. And that stems from like a lot of like institutional problems, such as, we don't have enough resources. There's only less than 1% of the uh, entire provincial budget that's dedicated to the environmental protection. And that's not just air pollution, that's also on water pollution, it's also on like landscapes and like other resources. So there's a very small share of the provincial budget that's devoted to air quality or environment in general, so that you don't have enough. You have this serious capacity and resource constraint to be able to monitor and enforce existing standards, right? So within those constraints and within that capacity, um, it's very hard to monitor the time, sort of the various sources of pollution in the city itself. So cleaner fuels is, of course, if you transition to cleaner fuels, that's great. But the fact is, you also need a fleet that needs to go with that. So this entails coming up with like a proper transport policy, which has to go in tandem with like our long-term public transportation system. And it's like I said, it's a complex problem because this also then ties into how we envision what Lahore should look like in the long term, right? Like, do we want to see more sprawl, or are we thinking about seeing Lahore as like a smarter, more dense city where people don't have to like commute long distances to get to work? Uh, and then what are but then that also implies that you need a proper public transportation system to move people around the city, right? And the long term, of course, transition is, instead of thinking about fuels, is also like our EV transition. So of course, if you move from gas powered vehicles to electric vehicles, that means you're not burning fuels, and so you're not producing emissions. But of course, the EV issue, or you still need the electricity and what those sources of electricity are, and like that's a whole nother ball game.
Mm.
That has to do with our like energy mix and our
I
energy
was going to
policy,
get
etc.
there.
But we won't go down that route.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
EV, I see EV as a long-term transition. So at least not not have. So you see a lot of not a lot. You see like every now and then you might see like a fancy Audi e-tron, which like costs like an arm and a leg. But that
Yeah.
those are toys for the rich. So it's not that the cars. I mean, of course, over time you might want to get like low cost, efficient EV cars that people can transition to. But really, we want to get the motorcyclists and the rickshaws to get them to the EV versions. But that's that's again that's something that our transport department has to sort of work on.
So, just getting to the sources of this, and I mean, you've explained it pretty well, but just thinking about it, the first part of your conversation was that a lot of this is due to, I'm not sure if I'm using the right word, but due to uh, the climatic zone that Lahore is in versus a place like Karachi, for instance, because Lahore is less windy per se, and Karachi is more windy, which is what takes the smog away. But my thinking is that, and then the second part of your conversation is about this being a man created and man made issue. And now, when we think about regulations and the work that the regulatory bodies and the EPDs in the provinces could do, it
Hmm.
seems like a lot of these would be man made and man created solutions, imagining that this is an entirely man made problem. So, do you
Yeah.
think that there could just be these kind of solutions could end up solving the problem, which apparently it seems is has a lot to do with the climatic conditions of Lahore and not per se with vehicular emissions and um, what individuals are doing in this world, like Lahore per se.
Yeah. I mean, this is a in pure economic terms, this is kind of like a market failure, right?
Yeah.
The emissions have a cost, but nobody's really bearing that cost. If
Mm,
they did, emissions would be lower.
mm,
So I don't go and like throw my trash in your house because if I did, I know you're gonna come and like beat me up, right? So there's a cost to like throwing my. But with it's the same thing with like the think about sort of passive smoking. If air is providing this kind of benefit, it's
mm,
it's a service that it's providing, which is it becomes a repository for our emissions. So it's a benefit that the air is providing, but nobody's really bearing the cost of like if you pollute, if you're like a smoker and you're smoking, the air is there's this externality that's happening. There's smoke going into the air. That's a service that the air is providing. It's taking in your byproduct, your waste product, but you're not effectively paying for it. If I were to force you to pay for it, your smoking consumption might actually go down, right? So in that sense, it's seen as like, so if you take this simple example of like smoking cigarettes and translate that into overall emissions, it's a problem of like market failure because like you're not really paying for the cost of like putting your pollution into the atmosphere, into our environment.
yeah.
But then if you look at particular sources, I think the problem becomes a little more challenging on crop burning. Part of the reason why we're experiencing a lot of crop burning is also because of migration issues from rural to urban areas. Now, we don't have like solid evidence in Pakistan, but we have evidence from India, for example. And that is now and this is this paper by Tivrat Garg and his co-author uh, in a recent paper that basically looks at these investments in road infrastructure, what that in rural areas, what that did was it increased mobility from rural to urban areas. So
Yeah.
a lot of the labor that the farmers were actually employing at one point to take out to work on their farms, a lot of that like moves out of rural areas and has moved to urban areas permanently or like on a short-term basis, especially like during the harvesting season. And so the phenomena behind crop burning, by the way, is that farmers the rice is a summer crop, and then they harvest that in sort of October or so. And then once they harvest that, they have a very short window to then plant their winter crop, which is predominantly wheat. And so when they harvest the rice, it leaves this stubble in the ground, and it's just like a little stalk. And that stalk basically needs to be removed before they can plant their wheat crop. Now, in the past, what they would do is that they would hire labor that would come in and then take out that stalk, right? But with more connectivity, better like road infrastructure, a lot of that labor has moved out of rural areas and into urban areas. As a result, wage rates in rural areas have gone up. So farmers, it's become very costly for farmers to actually hire labor to take that stubble out of the ground. And in the absence again of, even though crop burning is illegal, there is a law against that because monitoring enforcement is so weak. And even with monitoring and enforcement, I think there's a lot of leeway that is given to farmers because it has these larger like political economy considerations.
Yeah.
Farmers is just, farmers just find it like, it's just it's instead of paying for labor to come on the farm and take the stubble out, they just light it on fire and burn it. And so you get rid of the stubble within like, a day or two, and then you just, you're able to then plant the wheat crop. So now, so that's a market distortion that also, related to wage rates and the movement of labor out of rural areas to urban areas. How do we fix that? Well, one is to now there's another great paper from India in the Indian side of Punjab. This is payment for ecosystem services. So there's evidence, and this is through a randomized control trial, and this is by Seema Jayachandran and Kelsey Jack and co-authors, where they gave farmers money, and so the money is for ecosystem services, and in this case, it's to kind of to prevent them from burning their crop. And what they find is like giving these payments actually kind of encourages farmers to then to not burn the stubble. So that's one instrument, which is to effectively, I mean, in some ways, it's also like giving them like I said, the problem is tied to the fact that it's expensive for farmers to like get that labor. So if you compensate farmers, so they then they forego burning the crop. So that's one instrument. In the long term, I think the 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 um, uh, one of the solutions is related to technology. On the Indian side, and now there's a counterpart in Pakistan as well. They've developed something called the happy seeder, and so what the happy seeder does, it takes out it's like a machine, it's like a harvester, but it takes out the stubble, but also plants the wheat seed. Now, of course, you can like the technology in India, I think, is better than the indigenous machine that we have in Pakistan. So over time, I think we need to kind of like refine that technology. But there was a time during our agricultural revolution in the 60s and 70s when we were able to then like kind of get farmers to transition to these harvesters and threshers. And a lot of them kind of use them, and that's become the status quo in our farming. But that is something, getting farmers to transition from like burning their crops to actually like adopting the happy seeder, I think is perhaps a worthwhile long-term strategy that we should look into investing.
So I'll take you to another tangent now. Don't want to, discuss a lot of economic philosophy, but something that comes to my mind is, and from your discussion, I think this would be pertinent, that it seems that there are no market solutions to um,
Mm.
solving the air pollution problem, and it seems that there's a very, very strong role for the government, and apparently a lot of public sector economics, as you speak, plays into it. So as you speak, I'm thinking about market externalities and creating some sort of incentive mechanisms for the farmers, and so the government comes up with programs in which it pays the farmers or compensates the farmers, and I'm thinking about the ideas that somebody like Joseph Stiglitz would propose as a solution to this problem. So, do you think that there would be any, if we leave it to the market, are there any private solutions to this problem?
Well, I mean, like I said earlier, the reason we get pollution is because, I mean, it's a classic case of a market failure, right? Like
Yeah,
markets
yeah.
aren't able to provide us the efficient level of like emissions or air quality or, in a broader sense, the environmental quality that we want. So this is where you need interventions. this is a good case of where you need interventions, right? Now, what form does that intervention take is an important question. Governments can intervene the way that they usually do through what is called command and control. They'll come in and they'll ban certain activities, right? Like banning crop burning, for example, is one, or like setting standards and saying like,
Yeah.
you can't pollute, or
Yeah.
these industries shut down, or like this is the only amount that you can pollute, etc. Right? The problem with command and control is that for that to work is, let me go to another example. Like, for example, speeding is a command, and like setting a speed limit is a classic example of a command and control, right? Like
Yeah.
you have speed limits on the motorway in Lahore. You can't go above 120 kilometers per hour, but it's only like the speed limit only matters if you have that infrastructure to monitor and enforce those speed limits, right? If you don't have enough traffic police or motorway police, people are going to be, a lot of them are just going to be going above the speed limit. They're not going to care about whether you have these limits or these rules and regulations. The only time when it really starts working is when you have that like robust system to kind of monitor and enforce those. Part of it is you can have like, what reduces those costs. One is you employ a lot of cops, but over time now we have like speed cameras that reduce the cost of monitoring. You can send these like, once you like catch somebody going really fast, you can like just send the ticket to their home. You can tie it to their like CNIC or driver's license or their like car registration renewal. So that kind of reduces it. But the fact is that there is some level of monitoring enforcement happen. And in the context of air pollution, is the same thing, right? So we have these like standards, but standards are again the way like get information on how much you're emitting, and if you're going above the mandated standards that the government has set, then you need to pay a certain amount of fine. The problem, like I said, is like you're think about Punjab, you're getting like less than 1% of the annual provincial budget just devoted to environmental protection. So command and control is really, really like, you is very difficult to manage. The other issue with command and control too is that it leads to the way like our standards work is we have uniform standards across like all sources. So it might be cheaper for some sources to reduce their pollution versus others. So we want sources that sources that can reduce their emissions cheaply. We want those sources to then perhaps emit more because it's cheaper for them to actually like reduce their emissions versus those sources for whom reducing emissions is very costly. So if you have a uniform level of emissions across sources, then the overall costs of achieving a certain level of emissions increases because these marginal costs across sources is not the same.
Yeah.
So command and control for that reason it's not a very cost effective strategy. So that's why we look to sort of more to better, or better in the sense, more efficient strategies which reduce overall costs across sources. And so that's where sort of market-based or price-based mechanisms come in, right? So one of them is, is a tax on emissions, and that goes
Yeah.
back to this idea, it's a form of a Pigouvian tax. It's basically you're taxing emissions. So
Is
it's
it the
not
same
the
as carbon taxes? What we call
Yeah,
carbon
carbon
tax?
taxes. I think a lot of people confuse direct carbon taxes with indirect carbon
Yeah.
taxes. This is a
Yeah.
tax on emissions themselves, not really the activity what you're
Yeah.
producing, but like
Hmm.
what your actual emissions are.
Yeah.
So if I say that you're going to produce, let's say, 5 tons of, or so, 5 tons of, let's say, sulfur dioxide a year, and if I start taxing you on the amount of sulfur dioxide that you're producing per year, that's going to incentivize you to then reduce your if it's cheaper for you to actually like reduce your emissions than pay the or the tax that I'm setting, then that incentivizes you to kind of reduce your overall emissions, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
cost effectiveness, you need this tax on the overall level of emissions that you're doing. But again, you need that kind of, so here you have a price-based mechanism that is leading to an efficient solution, but it's not going to arrive indigenously. You need some sort of an authority that has to like then determine what the tax looks like and then be responsible for monitoring emissions and then sending you the tax bill and then collecting that tax. One advantage of this strategy, though, is what we call the double dividend. So not only are you, once you start putting the tax, you're also like, forcing polluters to pollute less, but as the government's also collecting a tax, right? Because the polluters are paying a tax on their emissions.
Yeah, yeah,
That can then be like used for other welfare enhancing strategies. The other market-based system is what we call cap and trade,
yeah.
or you can also think about it in terms of sort of carbon, or not carbon, but sort of environmental credits. But a cap and trade system is something that is used, or you have examples of a cap and trade system that's being used where there's a where you have where we cap the overall level of emissions. So that's where you have the regulation that you have to like the regulator sets a cap at the overall level of emissions, and then allocates distributes permits across. So you cap the emissions, and then you then set permits, or you produce permits. The aggregate of those, the whatever the allowances are in terms of what each permit allows you to emit, the aggregate of that is equal to what the cap is set at. And then you distribute that across sources, and then sources are allowed to trade those permits in market. So if all of us get the same amount of permits, let's say, but it's cheaper for me to reduce my emissions and it's more expensive for you to, and relative to me, it's more expensive for you to reduce your emissions, then perhaps we'll allow you to, I can buy permits from you and emit because it's cheaper for me to, I'll okay, so sorry, I didn't say that
You
correctly.
you
It's
you
basically
you'll
since it's
you'll
cheaper
sell
for
your
me,
permits to me
right?
because it's cheaper
Yeah,
for you to
exactly.
reduce them.
Yeah. You'll sell yours to me. Yeah. Well, you'll buy from me because like it's more expensive
Reduce
for
them.
you to reduce yours, right? But since the number of permits is fixed, right? That's equal to the cap that's been set. So, you're just meeting your target in a cost-effective way. Permits are
Right.
flowing from those who really need them. Permits are flowing from those who really don't need them to those who really need them,
Yeah.
right?
So if I correctly understand this, the cap and trade system would work like if you're an industry, it would be the opportunity cost for you to sort of reduce your emissions would be much higher than a residential consumer. And in that case,
Hmm.
a bulk of residential consumers, or perhaps a single residential consumers, could sell to an industrial unit because it's cheaper for them to reduce, right?
Theoretically, yes, that's possible, but like often what happens is markets are set within a particular kind of like,
Yeah, I
instead of
understand that.
allowing,
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
instead of distributing permits to residents versus like industries, it'll happen within an industry, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
for example, the first, so there are a lot of examples of like cap and trade markets for carbon. But like I said, carbon is a greenhouse gas emission that leads to this other problem of global warming, etc. But particulate matter is a localized problem, right?
Yeah.
It leads to local air pollution and has these health impacts. Gujarat in India has experimented with the world's first ever PM 2.5 particulate matter cap and trade system. And that's within sort of industries that emit PM 2.5. Um, so um, so this is not permits being traded across industries and residents, etc. It's like permits being traded within industries. So there was a cap on the overall emissions that was set by the Gujarat state. And then there were these permits allocated across industries, and then there was a market that allowed these like different industries to trade those permits. So
Last
industries
question.
that had better technology, there was like low cost way of like reducing their emissions. They were they could sell their permits to those firms that had like older technologies or probably like had to bear higher costs of like reducing each unit of emission. So you have this permit, and the results, there's, you know, the authors of that study basically say they're seeing some like valuable results from that study.
What are the measurement devices? Is it like some expensive infrastructure that needs to be installed to know who is emitting what?
Yeah, good
And
question. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, again, like with these kind of markets, again, like they work well. Like if you can ensure that firm, you know, you have a permit that allows you to emit a certain amount, but then you have to ensure like firms are actually meeting those their, you know, the actual emissions are within what's been allowed to them through the permits, right?
yeah,
So but there's it's been like there've been like technological advancements on that over time. And in India, they're using something called the SEM system, continuous emissions monitoring systems, where you have these like devices like attached to smokestacks. And then like those devices are kind of measuring in real time what emission levels look like. And so, you know, the state government or the regulator is kind of getting like real-time information on like what pollution levels are at
okay.
each source, PM 2.5, and then
Mhm.
they can corroborate that evidence with actual like allowances that have been given to these firms.
So these are like meters, like electricity meters that are providing
Yeah, they're
real-time
like
data to the
small, like
government.
yeah, they're monitors that are
Yeah.
installed at site. Yeah. So yeah, so measurement has always been an issue, but with these technological advancements, we're getting a better, you know, we're getting better methods of like
So so
enforcing these systems.
so how does the government though ensure? Like, I mean, I understand that the government gets the data that somebody has, for instance, attained the limit, whatever the cap is. How do you then ensure that industry X, for instance, who's attained the limit now or is beyond the limit? What do you do? Do you stop their operations for that month? You ask them to shut
No,
down for the remaining 10 days of the month or something?
yeah, yeah, but well, I mean, look, you know, there's the buying and selling of the permits is happening on exchange, and once that's happened, as a regulator, I have a, you know, suppose both of us, we're like two industries and we like buy and sell, and suppose after this buying selling you have two permits and I have like five permits.
Yeah.
You know, as the regulator, I have a good, I know that you're now that we exchanged the permits and you have two and I have five. And so given the monitoring system, the SEM system that I've installed, you know, I can see like what you're emitting and what I'm emitting. And then I have to see that like what I'm emitting is, you know, corroborates with how much I'm allowed to emit with those five permits that I have. And, you know, and what you're emitting, whether that corroborates with the two permits that you have, right? So there's that constant monitoring that the regulator needs to do as well. But if there is, if you know, I mean, again, if you they're legal. I'm not really sure how the Gujarat system works, but you can think about like kind of devising legal ways of like
Yeah.
penalizing
Yeah.
firms if they make more than their like
I was,
actual allow.
Dr. Samuel, I was part of this study done by World Bank called the Industrial Decarbonization Study. It was the first of its kind done within 5 sectors in Pakistan. And
Yeah.
we discussed the cap and trade system as part of this and the devices and the infrastructure that could be used. One big, thing that comes from the industry is that, a lot of these industries would then require boiler replacements, which is like a
Mm,
massive capital cost investment. And
mm,
and so either they just keep buying from the cap and trade system from other industries, and it would at
mm.
the end of the day just be net buying from all the industries, or the government
Yeah.
then either sets the cap too high to accommodate all of them, which would essentially mean that the potential to reduce emissions would be very, very low. Or the third option
Mm,
is that industries then spend the additional amount of capital to replace equipment, to buy cleaner equipment or more modern equipment that is more environmentally friendly. And even the bigger industries, and I could name a few, like I talked to people in the textile, big textiles like Nishad, for instance. They're saying that we could install something like solar panels or something if you want us to be cleaner, greener, more environmentally friendly. But this equipment, installing, replacing our boilers or like big equipment is way more expensive. Now, again, the question comes, does the government come in, uh, share some part of that cost as well? Because the industry say if the government comes in or the government imports those boilers and gives it to us at, say, some kind of monthly installment or something, we're ready to pay interest as well, but we do not have the finances to do the capital investment. And I think that's the biggest problem in the industry sector right now, which is also kind of a big hurdle towards adopting something like the cap and trade system.
Yeah. I mean, the technology advancement itself is beneficial because, if you're able to like transition to like cleaner, better boilers, for example, and you're reducing your emissions, then you have these extra like permits
Yeah.
that you can then sell off and make a profit off of, right? So so the incentive to actually adopt better technologies is kind of inbuilt into the cap and trade system. But the issue remains that, I mean, if the initial kind of investment is something that the firms can't bear upfront, then I mean, instead of fully subsidizing them, I mean, some level of like financing that go into getting these firms to get loans or to finance like adoption of the boilers you know could probably help. But I mean, if you think about this, in some ways, like these are private costs that firms have to bear, but this is one firm or like a handful of firms. But then the social cost of actually being exposed to air pollution is being borne by like millions of residents within like that area, right? So
Yeah.
the social benefits of actually a few firms doing this are the benefits versus the costs are probably like much higher. So from like a social point of view, like the collective gain or welfare gain that we get from this simple adoption is just like what the cost of uh, that financing or that initial kind of like upfront startup cost.
Dr. Samuel, while I want to talk to you more about this, we're past our allocated time for the show. It was wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for joining.